So now bringing it back to where this all started, we can talk about the weather, sort of the conditions that I was flying in on that day. The temperature was in the 40s, the sun was fairly low in the sky, and the winds were dead calm. There was not any breeze, at least at the ground level. The runway I was flying from was in the Moral Meadows flying field, which the runway itself is 400 feet long and runs due east and west, and it's 50 feet wide, so it's more than adequate for even large turbine jets. I assembled the B-70, so that involves attaching the wings and the front fuselage. Now, you guys haven't seen this yet, but on the day of, actually, I ended up drilling the mounting holes for some screws that would attach to the wings. The retracts, I actually had one of them fail on me in the days before the maiden flight, so I had the retracts trimmed full down so that they wouldn't be that much of a concern, so I couldn't actually accidentally retract them back up. So my flight plan was basically to get up, get down with no configuration changes to the vehicle, which would be retracting landing gear or flaps because that changes the CG or aerodynamic properties of the plane. And the reason I do that is to maximize the chance of success. I was planning on a minute 30 of flight time with 30 seconds to approach and land. What happened was I got around 2 minutes of flight time. I'll have to check the footage, but it seemed to be fine because the batteries ended up being at a good voltage. So one of the cameras that you're looking at right now, I actually had a camera pointed back towards the main landing gear on the underside of the Valkyrie. I also had another camera down at the end of the runway, unfortunately, because I was doing long exposure shots the night before. It didn't record properly. It recorded in 1 frame per second. I did get some cool shots from the low light level stuff, but in turn I missed the video from the second, or I guess third camera view. And on landing here, or actually on takeoff, you'll see that the mounting for the wheels to the landing gear itself can be improved. The glue that I used to hold the wheels on obviously wasn't strong enough, and some of them were able to slightly pop off, although they didn't fully come off. So in flight, things I noticed, there was a bit of wing rock. I'm not sure if it was self-induced or if it was just winds up at the higher levels, or if it was just a dynamic mode that the plane itself got into. But there was a bit of wing rock, a bit of roll hysteresis or instability. It wasn't that big of a deal. The CG felt spot on, and it seemed to fly pretty well, except for one thing, which was the trim. Oh my gosh, the trim. I was holding a lot of down elevator and a bit of left aileron and rudder, just to keep it flying straight and level. So I didn't actually have time to trim in flight, so I held that all throughout the flight. But other than that, it seemed to fly beautifully. The plane flies at a really, really high angle of attack, which I guess I should have expected for a delta wing, especially at this sort of higher wing loading, especially at low speeds, of course, which is a bit scary, and it could always look like it's on the verge of a stall, but from what I've seen, it seems to not care about that as much. It also has a pretty low thrust to weight, maybe a bit lower than I was expecting. I mean, I've had these performance numbers, but I haven't had a sort of chance to visualize them. So I made the decision to go around on the first approach because the angle relative to the runway seemed to be too great as I came in. And that wasn't really the deciding factor, it's just that I was a bit too fast and too high, and I was getting really far down the runway, and I just made the decision to go around there. And the second approach, you can see I come at a bit shallower of an angle relative to the runway. It's sort of difficult to get it straight in because you have to go really, really far and close to the road, which I don't like to do with such a big plane. And the second approach seemed to be much, much better. I still had a bit of excess altitude, but you could see I sort of bled that back. With large planes like these, you're using your throttle to control the altitude and elevator to control the airspeed, so there's sort of this reverse from what your normal foamy airplane will do. And with this, it seems to keep its energy much better than your typical foam airplane. The landing itself was a bit rough, I think, but I had to get it down before the end of the runway. And on landing, I overran the runway, which caused the nose gear collapse, which is really, really easily fixable. Ways to mitigate this, I guess, in the future, either slow down with stuff like S-turns, just sort of turning the plane back and forth to either make the path it has to travel longer or just increase the friction over time, or just simply land earlier on the runway, although that'll take a bit more practice. Maybe I'll have to stand in a different place. After the flight, the batteries ended up at about 3.7 volts per cell, just over, which is near optimal despite me forgetting to start my timer until my first downwind turn. I guess it would be downwind even though there is no wind, but it was the first time I was flying parallel to the runway in the opposite direction that I took off. And I was actually extremely calm while I was flying it. I was sort of surprised, but it looked fantastic in the air, and I was like, hey, this is so bad. And I just, you know, I gave it full throttle, and it just climbed right off. And I was like, well, it's fine now. There's nothing to be afraid of. So this plane will fly again. And until then, I'll see you guys next time.